カストはある日突然アンダーワールドと呼ばれるこの仮想世界に閉じ込められた。アンダーワールド、俺がテストダイバーとして関わっていた
Sword Art Online Last Recollection is the latest entry to the long list of titles the franchise has made over the years. Originally started out as a PlayStation Portable title with Infinity Moment, it soon found its way to creating a sequel with Hollow Fragment, a game where I personally started with and have kept myself going for more. Fast forward to 2023, and here we are, faced with yet another monstrosity. Sword Art Online Last Recollection is a direct sequel to 2020's Alicization Lycoris, where it followed the anime's fourth season, which tackles about Kirito's life in Underworld, a virtual world filled with AI that's capable of human-like emotion. However, Last Recollection delves into the latest season following that arc, but much like the previous game titles in the series, it brings its own unique twist by reimagining the events of that arc and creating something more, which more often than not just means Kirito gains more waifus before the end credits start rolling. But if you aren't familiar with Sword Art Online, and more specifically, the game's universe, then sadly enough, its story will feel a bit too inaccessible for newcomers.
キリト、昔話もいいですが、もうすぐ目的地の東
The
の
game's premise starts you off directly at the halfway point, within the entirety of the events in Underworld. At this point, you've already bested a great threat to the human empire, but by doing so, it also opened up the floodgates to a war between the human empire and the dark territory of Underworld. And this is also the time where the game deviates from its source material, which, unlike the anime, Dorothy, an original character for the game and a citizen of the Dark Territory, is trying to get in contact with the human empire to negotiate peace. This led to Kirito and the gang to act as peace ambassadors and travel to the Dark Territory in hopes of convincing the hostile factions to negotiate. It's a fun little story that tries to put its own twist, but frankly speaking, because the series has been going on for a long time, and its developer, Acuria, doesn't shy away from adding more to the pile of playable characters, a lot of the times, these characters never get to shine in its overall narrative, while Dorothy, the new main heroine of the game, gets to hog the spotlight for most of its runtime. It's a huge shame, but at the same time, I have to say that I do love the role that Dorothy adds to this. She's well fleshed out as a character and as a heroine that I enjoyed every bit of interaction I have with her. And getting to know her more as each chapter unfolds was really something that I enjoyed more than the actual struggle between the two halves of Underworld. As the child of sin, she's often discriminated by her own kind and struggled to fit in. But after traveling with Kirito and his companions, she finds the warmth of friendship, while still trying to distance herself at the fear of having to point her blade at them when the negotiation for peace crumbles. There's a lot more to her, however it's falling a bit too deep into spoiler territory, so I will just stop here. Last Recollection's gameplay is a bit similar to what Alicization Lycoris has, with a few minor and major changes to its features. They both follow an action-based hack-and-slash formula, with a huge emphasis on swordplay and skills, coupled with a bit of magic here and there. Here, you're able to mash a single button to execute a chain of combos that ends it up with a set of finisher skills that you can freely set to your liking. Unlike Alicization Lycoris though, you have a total of 3 sword skills for your finishers to chain together, unlike there where you're only allowed with 1. Similarly, you're still able to set a certain number of sword skills to use manually at the cost of SP. However, you are limited now with just 8 slots to fit everything, including your combat skills and sacred arts. You've also got your step, which acts as your dodge button, and 2 other action buttons that are namely switch and nice. With the switch button, you're able to swap out with your main partner, which can then be followed up by an attack that would stun the target. This has a cooldown before it can be used again, however. You also have another button to freely switch between your partners without the added benefit of the stun. On the other end of that is the nice button that does a few things, and one of them is to compliment your partner for doing certain actions, which improves their affinity with you. Meanwhile, you also get to have a guard button, which is like something you'll never use in combat. But probably the most prominent feature of Sword Art Online is its sword skills. Just remembering the first season's most badass moments, like Kirito's first group raid with the Floor 1 boss, which earned him the nickname of Beater that led him to becoming a solo player, or when he clutched a win by showing off the unique dual-wielding type against the fight with the Skull Reaper, was easily one of my favorite moments in the entire series. Accuria does this justice by having all the flashy moves in there. However, where they do drop the ball on this one is it never really feels like an exhilarating moment. It's flashy and it looks really good, but from a gameplay perspective, it just looks dull and uninteresting, and I'm saying that as someone who has spent over 800 hours playing Alicization Lycoris. The biggest problem that Alicization Lycoris had was its massive power spikes when it comes to stacking buffs and debuffs that, most of the time, bosses are dead in under a minute. Last Recollection, however, faces a problem that enemies are huge damage sponges, making boss fights take way longer time, without any actual strategy or a lot of mechanics to juggle with, to keep the fight interesting. It's just you, the boss, and a flurry of attacks to slowly whittle down their massive health bars. This is especially frustrating when you're playing alone and fighting endgame beasts, or doing the raids that takes roughly an hour or more to beat because of their bloated HP bars. Despite its underwhelming combat, there are some new features and improvements to the gameplay though. It doesn't particularly make the game feel any better, however, it does feel like a step to the right direction. Tactical Arts is probably the best feature the game has yet. While it isn't a completely new feature, it is a major improvement to its counterpart in Alicization Lycoris, where recording AI behavior was made to be more complicated than it should be. With Tactical Arts, you can set a number of skills that can be chained up to a total of 5 at a time, which can also be branched into a different set of commands if conditions are met. These skills can be activated in a number of ways, like after finishing a normal attack combo, or when their HP reaches a certain percentage. Although you can also manually force them to execute these actions at the cost of ally gauge. But much like any RPG, nothing is complete with the vast amount of loot and gear. Now, considering how awful Alicization Lycoris went down that rabbit hole, Last Recollection felt like a godsend. When it comes to gear and loot, the variety of stat spreads is not as horrible as the previous game, which was a literal nightmare to even get something worth using. Last Recollection at least doesn't have that problem, and only have some slight deviations from the same pieces of gear, and more of that god rules are reserved to having skills, versus to not having them, which honestly wasn't that hard to get outside of fights just being super long and single player, versus online with 4 people. However, what does feel like a step down is its multiplayer feature. Alicization Lycoris allowed you to explore a friend's world and play the story together, but Last Recollection doesn't. Instead, when joining people in multiplayer, you're warped into a room and need to interact with a slate that will teleport the party to the quest location, and after you're done with it, the group gets taken back to the previous room. It basically tones it down to a hub-based RPG like Monster Hunter or God Eater, but without the fun and exhilarating fights they bring, nor the massive and interconnected areas. Just the plain, old, boring, circular fields the enemies are originally located in. The Dark Territory, the world the game takes place on, is also a bit of a mixed bag, compared to its predecessor. Unlike Alicization Lycoris, which took place exclusively in the Human Empire, the Dark Territory takes a more traditional layout, with interconnected paths and hallways, compared to the massive open areas it had before. If I didn't know better, I would probably assume that this was the older game and Alicization Lycoris was its sequel. On the bright side, its smaller scale does make the game run smoother, especially with the controls being a bit more responsive. It's just a real shame that even despite its smaller scale, it still feels like this new playground has far less areas to explore, and not a lot of variety of items and gear to keep for the endgame grind, especially since they took away the crafting system it had before. Sword Art Online Last Recollection is something that I feel a bit biased about. I do love the games for its grind and what it's trying to do despite its shortcomings. However, if I try to look at it objectively, the game itself is terrible. The game's combat system is a slugfest of mashing buttons mixed with boredom. Not to mention, across all its different weapon types, they all feel and play the same. Its story, which has its cool moments, is a bit of a nice touch, but at the end of the day, it just feels like a Super Smash Bros. Ultimate where every character starts popping out of nowhere trying to help out but doesn't particularly shine through. Its multiplayer and in-game grind, which was supposed to be the thing that's going to keep me pushing through 100 more hours, was honestly over before I even started it. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of grinding to get through here. From your endgame weapons to your armor, and even accessories and skill masteries, but despite all that, it just feels monotonous and repetitive. I can't say I can recommend this game at all to newcomers, because this is something that you need to be a fan of the game to actually enjoy for a while. And for everything else gaming, choose Envision.
A community built by gamers.